Hello and welcome everyone to the Illusion Horror and Con YouTube channel. We have partnered with the folks at Helmgast, precisely Cult Divinity Lost, and we are bringing you an interview series that we kind of focus on the creative voices behind the Cult Divinity Lost Kickstarter, Dark Realms, and Other Horrors. If you haven't done so, the campaign is still live until Friday this week, February 28th. 6 p.m. Central European Time. I'm David, this is my wife Crystal, and we are today joined by Zachary Vaudo, who is one of the contributors to the campaign Kickstarter. And yeah, Zach, would you like to give us a short introduction of who is this man that we are talking to tonight?
Sure thing. Hi, folks. I'm Zachary Vaudo. I am primarily a TTRPG actual play performer, both on the player side and the GM side. The tagline is I am wherever tabletop games are played because I'm all over the place on no particular channel. Much like my own heritage, I'm a nomad in that regard. I also make music both just for personal enjoyment and for a lot of tabletop streams and other streams under the moniker SneakerNet. Uh, and that's pretty much where you can find me all across the internet.
Fantastic. Yeah, we
Excellent.
we we have in the past kicked off these interviews with a simple question, but often a deep one. What inspired you to write for horror scenarios, and what brought your passion to the horror realm?
Horror in general was a bit of a slow build for me, which coincidentally is my favorite type of horror. But it wasn't, unlike a lot of people that I know, it wasn't something that I was very into as a child, and it's always been there with me.
Mm,
It was something that I was slow exposed to over time. Lots of elements of things that I was very involved in had elements of horror that wound up appealing to me in horror medium down the line. It is going to come as no surprise to anybody watching who knows me, but I was a big fan of the book series Animorphs, which introduced a lot of body horror as a
Yes.
concept across the book series. Which made me very receptive to works of like David Cronenberg as I got
mm,
older. Uh, 90s television shows and movies as well had elements of horror that were scary but not scary, and that bled me into it over time. Then I got into thrillers and psychological thrillers, and then eventually over time got into more and more horror, and it just became one of those tiny seeds that grew over time. uh, in terms of actually writing it just was the creative energy there. I like to create things. I don't have any particular reason why I must write and must create. It's perhaps something I can attribute to my ADHD. I get an idea in my head, and eventually I have to do something with the idea. And that comes in the form of writing, music, performance, just about anything that I am capable of doing.
mm,
And so it just
Yeah.
grew from there. This particular scenario that I wrote for actually got inspired by a horror thing and a non-horror thing. The horror thing is the art of Jeff Lee Johnson. Johnson makes a lot of art that it's set in what looks like a regular scenario, but the more that you look at things, the more out of place things there are. For this one, it was the art piece Blue Plate Special, which is set in a diner. And the more you look, the more creepy things that you see there, such as blood on the corner of a table, a skull in the coffee, a tentacle coming out of somebody's jacket. And just the more you look, the more off things are. And I am based in Atlanta, which is the highest population density of Waffle Houses in the entire United States. And
mm.
therefore, this art piece translated in my head to our closest approximation to a diner, and also our closest approximation to a present liminal space in Atlanta, because
Mm.
just about anywhere that you go in the state of Georgia, there will be a Waffle House somewhere.
Fantastic.
It's it's actually a little refreshing to because we've done a number of these interviews at this point. It's nice to hear somebody say something that is not Clive Barker as far as their inspiration. And in Animorphs is just like
Yep.
it's
I'm not
prime.
going to
It's
lie.
prime.
I'm not gonna lie, Hellraiser is my favorite horror movie, so I'm not off of that train.
Yeah.
But it wasn't like
For
the
sure.
big one for me
Yeah.
For
in that
sure. For
regard.
sure.
Mm.
Yeah. It's just nice to hear something other than like, oh yeah, I picked up a Clive Barker book when I was 6 years old and I was hooked ever since. And
Yeah, no, honestly, my like literary segue into horror again, urban fantasy and Animorphs are like the big move in, and then eventually
yeah.
just got into it from there. No, if I'm gonna name a writing inspiration, it's an author named Donna Lynch. She's
Mm.
a horror writer that has written the only book to actually disturb me. That I've ever read. It's a book called Isabel Burning, and that level of ability to viscerally discomfort me is something that I have strived for whenever I do horror gaming, and in this case, horror writing.
Mhm.
Oh, I'll be making a note on that author for sure.
Mhm.
So you talked a little bit about your scenario that you wrote. How did you get affiliated with Kult? How did you start writing for them?
So this scenario, as I mentioned, I do actual play,
Mhm.
performing and streaming, and as a player and the GM. This scenario in particular was conceived as one of those streams. Uh, I worked with the team at Gehenna Gaming back in 2021 when I had this idea, and I pitched it to them. I got involved in Cult from Gehenna Gaming. They had me on a couple of their Cult games and miniseries, and I really liked the setting. I really liked the series. I liked the propensity for horror and disturbing horror, and the freedom that I felt it gave with creating. Once you like, I, it sounds silly since I am writing one of these scenarios, but it gives you the ability to break away from the pre-existing scenarios and just develop
Mhm.
horror within uh, the source material that it has. But so I pitched it to Gehenna Gaming, and they had me run it as a one shot. Back in 2021, it had performers uh, Nick Francia, who's part of Gehenna Gaming, April Ray, Samantha McClarty, and Persephone, uh, all performed in it. Full run through. It was a lot of fun. A lot of people liked it. They liked it. It's actually disturbed them, which I am still proud of. And it just, again, that hyperfixation bit that I mentioned to you, it just sort of stuck in my head of like, this was actually a really good story. And I would hate for it to only exist in this one form that never, that just stays static on the internet forever. And I just got the idea of, what if I just pitched this idea to Helmgast? What if I sent them the scenario as a proof of concept of, hi, I have a scenario. It's not fully written out yet, but it's start to finish built, and I can expand on it. So I pitched it to Helmgast, and then Petter and Gabe got back to me, and they were more than happy to bring it on. And they gave me a significant amount of freedom to actually build it out and write it out. There's an editing process, but there is no part of the game that I feel I did not want to have in there. Everything came from the material that I wanted there to be, and that's very refreshing and probably misrepresentative of what writing for publishers in general is like, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
no.
that's cool.
What would you say in the writing process were for you the biggest challenges and maybe obstacles that you kind of faced, and how did you overcome them?
For the scenario in particular,
Yes.
again, given that I started this as a self-enclosed game, that meant that I had everything start to finish, and I had a single path built out that the players had done. I put things in front of them, but I let the players control where they take things. They choose to get involved with things and go into things, etc. And that meant that when I pitched the idea to them, I had what I guess would be more equivalent to a story, like a start to finish short story. Developing it out into something that anybody could play in any way they wanted to is challenging. When you have an idea and you know the way it's supposed to go, you then have to take that idea and acknowledge that people are not going to do it exactly this way, and therefore you have to give options, and you can't just give like close-ended options. To a degree that to agree with Cult, I can, because typically in Cult you're aiming towards an end goal or two, but you have to understand that players have agency in any good game, and they are going to do things in whatever order they want to do. So figuring out how to write and build out this single story into a tangible world that players could actually get involved in and dive themselves into, despite the limited space, was a big hurdle. I managed to do it with a lot of help and rather a lot of encouragement from Gabe. But yeah, it was tough at first to build like, okay, well, how am I going to give a series of options of things that could happen here when, I know what happened in the game. Should I come up with, a table for them to roll on? Should I come up with two or three things? What if they decide they don't want to go into this one room? What's in the other room? What's in the back of the Waffle House that the players on the stream didn't go back into? That's an entire room. That's an entire room that exists, and these players could go back there. So suddenly I have to think of what is back there, and what if they want to do things back there instead of up front? World building is always difficult, and it's even more difficult when it comes from a linear idea.
Yeah.
I think that's also very, how do I phrase this? This is definitely something you see from, I mean, I also started from the old school D&D, which is very streamlined. You have a narrative that is, from point A to B to C. And on that way, you have, X amount of encounters. These kind of just level you up. It's kind of a very narrow kind of storyline. And I have to say, like, Call of Cthulhu at some point opened up the idea of, players can actually go to different locations. So, like, the GM kind of follows them. And then you have something like Cult, where, like, you can have two people sitting in a room and just prompt them with ideas, and that creates the whole narrative for, like, 4 hours of absolute gruesome, wonderfully gruesome discussion, which I think is very different and makes it hard to write for, especially since you don't know. Are they just maybe gonna sit there for 4 hours and not even get up from their chair? How do you make them to get up, right?
Exactly. That is something that I had to consider in this, because you start in the Waffle House, you're sitting in booths and at the counter and at tables, and what if they don't want to get up and explore the Waffle House? What if they don't want to try to leave the Waffle House? What if they do just sit there and sort of take it in? How do you prompt people to do stuff? I think it's also, like, you're definitely right. That origin of, Dungeons and Dragons and that type of storytelling definitely is a big influence into it. But I think that's also just in general how we as people perceive stories. Stories tend to be linear. Even if they bounce all over the place, they tend to be linear. And I think that the notion of open world storytelling is a very particular skill. GMs and DMs and storytellers that are able to provide a world that you are able to play in regardless of the system, I highly value those people, because it is not something that everybody can do. And writing it out for, just writing it out where your voice no longer matters as soon as it hits the page and people are playing it, even more so.
Yeah. I always like the idea of writing a scenario from just like a one-off story that I've done with a group, right? But then, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because you have the linear story, but you don't have any of the auxiliary stuff around it. And that's just a very,
Exactly. I did save myself in that regard by limiting the location. Like, it's set entirely within this Waffle House. It's like other cult stories will take you to set many different locations, and you have to build out the world. But I saved myself in that regard. But nevertheless, still, like, what is the auxiliary story here? What is going to happen if they go into a different room? I did get lucky, like, between when I pitched it to them and when they said yes, I was running games at a local convention in Atlanta called MomoCon, and I brought that scenario with me for people to play, and they chose to go into the back of the Waffle House, into the back room area, and I had a general idea of what they might be able to do at that point, but I had to build it out from that point. So suddenly, this second group that did an entirely different thing gave me a perspective of, okay, now I have two groups that have done two different approaches and two different mentalities to this. Now I have two simultaneous stories I can write, and that is a great basis for building out a multi-option story, an open world, because now I have more than one path to think on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely wholeheartedly agree, because I also have like two groups that I often play with, and regular groups. So like I know when I write a new scenario, I usually run it with one group first, and they play test it to the extreme. I get my first path, and then I give it to the other group, and then I suddenly, okay, this now requires something else.
They
But
break it. They go insane.
exactly.
Do all the things that you didn't anticipate.
Absolutely,
What would you say is maybe something that you value from the system of Cult that helped you also in kind of writing this out a bit, compared to maybe other systems that have this? Or what is the uniqueness of your story that brings it to Cult? If you don't want to spoil it too much, obviously.
I think the uniqueness that I tried to bring in was the sense of uncertainty and unreliableness in what you're perceiving. I tried very hard to not lean in on the major tropes of Cult until you're in the end game of it. For the most part, things are very fluid in how you can approach it. I actually do encourage the GMs that play this game, with the consent of the table, of course, to gaslight their players a little bit, because it's going to be much more fun if you slip in something horrifying, the player asks you what, and then you repeat what you said without that thing. And now suddenly, they know that you left it off, but the player itself is like, wait, did I actually see that in the first place? I like a lot of Cult settings, but again, that Clive Barker-esque element of it, a lot of them will go for the horror thing sort of out the gate. And I liked leaving things a little more uncertain to have the air of suspense of something wrong versus just something wrong. You can tell something's wrong in this game within the first 15 minutes of the gameplay, but to the extent of what's wrong, it's a slow burn. It's a slow build.
I think that's a good reference to your inspiration earlier, the coffee house picture. That the longer you look at it, the more kind of unique features you find.
Exactly.
And okay. Crystal?
In terms of the the system of Cult itself, sorry, I realized I
answered please.
Halfway.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, but in terms of the system itself that allowed me to do this, I think that the mechanical element of the dark secret in Cult helped build that out as well, because one of the biggest I don't want to say trope, because it tends to have a negative connotation, but I mean it for exactly what it is, which is a tried and true practice. The trope of Cult of the Dark Secret, where you slowly learn more of it over time, helps with that. And the encouragement, which is not something I had in the original playthrough of this. So they encouraged me, hey, we want you to see if you can work in the Dark Secret of this. And or rather, there is a reveal that happens in the game, but it was all at once at the end for them. So they said, hey, take that and spread it. And that fit extremely well with the practice of revealing the horror. Now you're also slow revealing the internal story as well. So that mechanic helped to really elevate the concept that I was already writing with in a way that I did not think of previously.
Now, your scenario is in the Scarlet Bright and Other Tales, which is a full-blown scenario compared to the horror starters in Broken Reflection. So your scenario comes with pre-gens, it sounds like?
Yes, it comes with 4 pre-gens, and we'll see if this bit is still in there because it's entirely up to them. But I provided at the very end an option for a fifth character, but it's a fifth character that should only exist if the other four are already in there, just to make something a little bit more interesting for players that maybe have one extra person. And I also provided a way to use this as a way to then segue into other longer stories as well, instead of just staying entirely enclosed. It depends very much on the approach that you take in the game. But yeah, I wanted to give you characters that you could play. And then if you really liked this system and liked this story, you could continue to play them because they have their own story, but there's still a lot more to who they were before the moment that you have them that you could build on and learn from.
That's good to know. It feels like there's a lot of cult stories that are very insular as far as like you play this game with these characters and at the end of it, that's probably going to be it.
Right. And that's the way that I've run games as well. Most of the streaming games that I have GM'd have been one shots or miniseries, so they are self-enclosed to that same right. So I can respect that and appreciate that, but I liked the idea of being able to take this and continue onward. And that's why the pre-gens just have archetype names. They don't even have actual names. That's for you, the player, to own so that you can personalize it, especially if you want to continue beyond this. Now, it is very much your character. It's just supplied with a backstory, and then you can build everything that's connected to it from there.
How easy is it to play your scenario with self-made characters to just throw your scenario hook in an ongoing campaign?
I actually don't think it's easy to do that. I think that this is very much intended for these characters. It could be done, but your character would have to accept the dark secret of these pre-gens, or create a version of the dark secret that aligns with it, which may not gel with who your character was, because these people have very specific origin stories to who they were. So it is meant to be meant to be either self-enclosed or as a starter for people that are getting into Cult and wanting to kick off from there.
Fantastic.
And I wish I could have thought of a way to do more open-ended stuff, but in order to force the narrative via the dark secret, it's not easy to just leave it open.
Like that.
I mean, if it's tailored to specific events, then obviously, that's very hard to kind of incorporate other ways. Crystal.
I'm actually curious about, the scenario sounds really cool. I'm very excited to read it. Like to know about some of your other writing projects, either from the past or other projects that you're doing currently that you can talk about.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of game writing, I've only written one published game scenario before this, and it was a scenario for liminal horror. Not like in this regard where the publisher is accepted me to write this, but the folks at Liminal Horror highly encourage like external contribution, and they want their system to be built out by other people. So I independently built out a scenario called Tower of Convergence for the Liminal Horror system. That has gone over pretty well. It like once a month, like every month I get like one or two pings that somebody has downloaded the project, so people still seem to want to be playing it. I appreciate that a lot. But beyond that, things that I've written previously were very narrative. I've got a couple of published novellas within the urban fantasy genre. I had a lot of horror short stories that published in magazines back like 10, 15 years ago. And I contributed in script writing for a couple of seasons for a horror anthology audio drama called The Blood Crow Stories. I started in as a voice actor for that and got involved in the show very heavily and contributed for writing for about a season and a half, I think, of it, and also contributed music to it. And that's where the music project spun out of. Right now, I've got a couple of projects that I'm working on writing, but they are decidedly not horror. One of them is a bit more urban fantasy, but the other one is just very, very, very different. Neither are in any position to talk about because they're just, I don't even know if I'm going to publish them myself. I'm going to pitch them to somebody, etc. Most of my most of my writing time has been dedicated either to the music or to coming up with stories for streams. Right now, I'm working on running a stream on Twisted Fate's channel called Inevitable. That is the name of the series and the name of the game system, which will be coming out later this year. Inevitable is very Dark Tower influenced. It's an Arthurian Western in an apocalyptic setting where everything is prophesized to end. And therefore you are playing to forestall the prophecy and or do something legendary so that your name lives on.
Easy.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Now, you said, or you mentioned already a couple of those, but doing a lot of GMing, writing, and so forth. Where do you take your inspiration from most of the times? When it comes to your current projects and
no, totally. GMing style, I try to pull from a lot of the people that I have played under because I learned different styles. I learned a lot of different styles of practice from this, like that pseudo gaslighting that I mentioned came from a guy named Mark who used to be affiliated with Gehenna Gaming. He did that to us in one Kult game, and I loved it, and I have implemented it across the board in many games to great success. A lot of my mind for storytelling comes from another GM named Ellie Collins, who also wrote the Bloodcrow stories. She created a show that I was on called ATL by Night, which is a Vampire the Masquerade series. And she has an amazing mind for world building, that open narrative storytelling, and keeping things narrative without being on rails too much. From a lot of people in general. But in terms of like the actual content, that goes back to that sort of hyperfixation element. I get an idea in my head of wouldn't it be cool for this, and then I find a system that matches the story, and then I build it out from there. It's all over the place. It doesn't have any particular rhyme or reason to it. It just is an idea that starts small and cascades and grows from there. But it leads to some very interesting things, and it allows me to do very out of the ordinary things with some of these game systems. Back again, like in 2021, I did a Vampire the Masquerade one shot, but it was me going, I want this particular system, but all of the stories for Vampire the Masquerade are written either in the modern day or in the past. There's nothing in the future. I want the future. And so I created a game called Vampire 2099, where I took a cyberpunk world, but it's entirely still the Vampire the Masquerade setting. And that was just that one idea that cascaded from there.
Nice.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think as we're sort of winding down the interview, any final thoughts? Anything you want to plug your sites, your stuff?
Sure. Yeah. Plugging my stuff again. I'm everywhere on the internet at Sneakernet or Sneakernet Music to find any of my music projects or any of my socials for games that I'm playing in or running or maybe writing. I tend to be involved with a lot of different lot of groups and channels like Gehenna Gaming, the Hype Goblin, Twisted Fates, Noir Enigma. I'm doing a lot of stuff with him that's hopefully coming out later on. But I am really all over the place. So there's too many channels for me to name it when I go. In terms of like final thoughts, though, I guess we mentioned it earlier. David, you mentioned how you do this with the tables that you play with and run with. If you're writing a scenario, play test it. Absolutely play test it. I got lucky by starting this as a game that I ran on stream and then having it at a convention before I wrote it. So I did it backwards and play tested it first, so I knew it wrote. But if you don't play test it, you don't know if it works. Ideas are so cool when they're in your head, and there's a 50-50 shot that they stay cool when they're out of your head. So yes, make sure that
Agreed.
you're writing a game for other people and not just for you.
Yeah.
Do you have maybe any last tips for aspiring writers or scenario writers, horror fans that want to kind of do similar things?
Aspiring musicians,
Aspiring
aspiring
musicians.
AP actors.
Write, compose, act, emulate what you love, but make it your own. It's very easy to pantomime, and it's very easy to fall into pantomiming, but never forget your own voice in what you do. Otherwise, you are just creating an homage to somebody else, and eventually the homage will run out, and people will wonder what you do. In terms of specifically horror writing, the easiest advice I can give is to write what scares you. Or if not a lot of things scare you, write things that inspire you, write things that seem cool in that twisted way. Maybe you're like me and you have those random hyperfixation thoughts of, wouldn't that be really screwed up if, go from there. And just write. You're going to write a lot of things that aren't going to go anywhere. You're going to have a lot of files on your computer or in your folders that are unfinished, and that's okay, because eventually you're going to finish something else, and or you're going to come back and look at something and go, that was a great idea. I'm going to build on that. And that's not just horror writing. That's also music. That's anything as well. I have been known to revisit works that I left off in a half-finished state. God, I literally just found a music cover that I was doing that I started in 2010 and I didn't touch. And I pulled it back up just a month ago and went, this is actually mostly done and not bad. I can make this with better instruments, and I'll be finishing that this year.
Yeah.
So
Fantastic.
just go for it.
I mean, yeah. Also, I'm sure you have improved your skills since then too. So, yeah.
I've improved my skills, but I've also accepted a piece of advice that another musician taught me, and I put this into anything that I'm doing. It's a musician from a band called Angel Spit, which is, just to paraphrase his advice, is don't wait for the perfect thing. Like if you want to make a music project, but you're waiting to like get a guitarist or a drummer involved, don't. Find a way to make that sound on your own. Use a drum machine, use a DAW with a guitar VST to make the sound, and just make the music. And either you'll eventually find the person that you need to play that part, or you'll realize that you never needed them in the first place. But if you're going to wait for the perfect thing to come along, that's exactly what you're going to be doing instead of creating.
Yep.
I think that's more valuable than just honing your skill, is going for it. That's the only way you can hone your skill.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think with these inspirational words, we want to say thank you again for joining us and this
Thank you very much.
insightful interview about the creative minds of the Cult Divinity Lost Kickstarter Dark Realms and Other Horrors. Tonight with Zachary, but Vaudo. And thank you very much, and see you all soon. And back to Kickstarter if you haven't done so.